Good morning from Crete. It's a cooler December morning. Welcome to Equip, Build, and Mature. As I like to do on Saturdays, I want to give an overview of one of the books of the Bible, and today we'll be looking at the Gospel of Matthew. First question, who wrote the document? Well, Matthew did not sign his name to the gospel that bears his name, but the early church consistently confirmed in the first century and even into the beginning of the second century, confirmed that Matthew wrote the book. As early as AD 140, a disciple of Jesus named Papias wrote that Matthew gathered sayings of Jesus in Hebrew, probably before he translated them into Greek, and he wrote it in Greek so he could have hit a larger audience. Now, Matthew's name appears in all the lists of the 12 apostles, but Mark and Luke, they refer to him as Levi or Levi. Being a tax collector set Matthew apart from all the other 11. In Matthew 9:9, Jesus called Matthew to follow him. Immediately after Jesus called him, Matthew invited all of his so-called sinful friends to a feast to honor Jesus in Matthew's home. And Matthew did not at all think it strange that he and Jesus would associate with sinful and broken people from their society. What time in history did this take place? Of the four Gospels, Matthew is the most Jewish-centered. He regularly quoted the writings of the Old Testament prophets. And it seems to be that his intention was to prove Jesus' identity as Israel's long-awaited Messiah. It's difficult to date Matthew's Gospel. Several factors point to a date around 60 to 65 AD. So here's the first factor. The book does not mention the temple's destruction in AD 70. Such a major event would have likely been mentioned in a document primarily directed to a Jewish audience, to prove that Jesus was the promised Messiah. Second factor is the book's obvious Jewish emphasis suggests that it was written at a time when Jesus' disciples focused on sharing the gospel primarily with Jews. Now, this became less common as the decades passed by. And the third reason is many scholars assume that Mark was the first gospel written. So Matthew was probably written soon after the Gospel of Mark. So why is this book, this gospel written by Matthew, so important for us? Well, the Apostle Matthew was a Jew, and he had a definite Jewish perspective on the person of Jesus and on the work of Jesus. He included more than 50 direct citations and even more indirect references from the Old Testament about God's promised Messiah. And this exceeds any of the other Gospels in the number of quotes and citations from the Old Testament. So it indicates that Matthew wrote with the Jewish population in mind. His extensive connections between Jesus and the Old Testament prophets offer plenty of prophetic evidence for Jesus' entire ministry and his life. But they also give 21st century readers a brief look into how first century readers approached the Old Testament with a Jesus-centered mindset. Matthew also answered the question on the mind of every Jewish reader. If Jesus is the King of the Jews, then where is God's promised kingdom? Well, Matthew reveals that Jesus did offer his kingdom to Israel, but they rejected his offer. We see this in Matthew 4:17, in Matthew 16:13 to 28, and in chapter 21, verses 42 and 43. Now, today, God's primary work in the world is accomplished through the expansion of Jesus' church. God will decide when Jesus will return, and when he does return, God will take his faithful covenant disciples with him to heaven to be in his eternal presence, something we all should be looking forward to. So what is the big idea? What's the emphasis of this gospel written by this tax collector, Matthew? Well, Matthew wrote his account of Jesus' ministry to show that Jesus was, and still is, in fact, the king. He was the long-awaited Messiah of Israel. And Levi, or Matthew, shared this concern in his opening line in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. It says, the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Then Matthew consistently took his readers back to the Old Testament to provide proof of Jesus' birth. First, he says that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Second, he tells us that Jesus' family escaped to Egypt when Herod was killing all the baby boys 2 years and younger because he was afraid there was someone that was going to be king instead of him. Third, Herod murdered all these baby boys. And fourth, Jesus began his ministry. At that time, many Jews claimed to be the Messiah. But Matthew faithfully revealed the life of Jesus in the Old Testament that exalted him above all the false messiahs. Matthew described Jesus in a way that clarified how unique Jesus was from all those who were deceivers. So how does this gospel apply to us in the 21st century? After 400 years of prophetic silence, the Jews wondered if God had left them, if he had deserted them or abandoned them. After centuries of regular communication from God, the Jews had no genuine prophet. They had no spokesman for God. But the ministries of John the Baptizer and the ministry of Jesus reminded the Jews that God had not forgotten them. God's silence during that 400 plus years period, it laid the groundwork for emphasizing the coming of John, who prepared the way for the final piece of God's redemptive plan, God in the flesh, Jesus the Messiah. God had not forgotten. He remembers. He remembers his promise, and he remembers his faithful covenant and the covenant that he made with his covenant people. And Matthew made that very clear. It was true then, and it's true today. Do you ever feel as if God has deserted you or abandoned you, or that God is sitting in silence as you make your requests and we're getting no response from him? Matthew revealed Jesus as Israel's promised Messiah and their king. So by faith, we believe that he came to the earth as God in the flesh. We learn of his deep love for humanity and for us. Jesus is now resurrected and ascended, sitting in the throne room in heaven. He will always be with us as we walk with him each day by faith, living on his mission until the last day of our lives. That's Matthew 28, verse 20. Jesus expects his covenant disciples to be committed to his mission. We see this in Matthew 28:19. Make disciples of all the nations. Jesus today continues to build his church as he works through each of us. You and I need to make every effort to be righteous as he is righteous. Guys, hope you have a great Saturday. May God continue to bless each of us as we strive to learn more of God, but God's seen most clearly through the life and the work of Jesus, his Messiah. You guys take care.